Greetings, everyone. My name is Dr. Christopher Shaw, and welcome to my very first episode from a podcast dealing with topics in religion and theology in and for a modern world. So, in this case, you might find it interesting because rather than seeing theology and secularity, or religion and secularity, or Christianity and secularity as two components of culture that are in opposition, this podcast actually looks for ways for a constructive dialogue between these two definitive features of culture, and looks for constructive ways forward and a way of bringing these two notions together in a way wherein they can be symbiotic rather than um, detrimental to one another or in a state of constant opposition. So I'll just say a little bit about myself. My name is Dr. Christopher Shaw. I'm from the United States. I now live here in Berlin, Germany, and I've been in Germany for quite some time. I have a doctorate from the University of Oxford in theology and religion. I taught at the Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin as a lecturer in systematic theology and the philosophy of religion for many years. And now I'm actually teaching various universities in the United States online, as well as a school here in Berlin where I teach religion and theology as well. And I'm also able to podcast in my free time. Interestingly, for this podcast, I'm recording from the Dietrich Bonhoeffer House in Berlin, that's actually the Bonhoeffer family house in Berlin. And a bit more about this later, but it's a very interesting location considering the kind of thematic motifs of this podcast, and the fact that Bonhoeffer himself will be one of the main figures that guides kind of the intellectual trajectory that we follow in the in this episode and those that are coming in the near future. So I'm extremely grateful to um, the Bonhoeffer House for welcoming me here to do this podcast, and it's an absolute pleasure to be sitting in his family's library recording this video for you all. More on Bonhoeffer will come a little bit later, but I just want to do a brief introduction to the podcast so we know what you're getting yourselves into. So, this podcast will deal with a variety of ideas and themes in theology and the philosophy of religion, although you can expect these topics to be addressed in a rather unconventional manner. Its primary aim is to connect with an audience of wide-ranging interests and backgrounds, and especially those who are interested in taking their theological inquiries one step further. Even so, there is an acute appeal to the religious situation of our age, one where many are agnostic or unsure about religion or simply just don't think about it that often. In my experience, this roughly construed demographic represents the majority of the people that I encounter in daily life. Interestingly, and amidst their uncertainties, this group, in general, often seldomly and completely rejects any notion of God whatsoever. Instead, they remain curious and open to the general concept of divinity as a possibility, and one that, if presented correctly, might become of enormous interest to them. Now, while reaching those within the aforementioned category is the key task of my own personal vocational project, to be sure, the content will also be interesting for those who from other backgrounds as well. In other words, the entire spectrum of religiosity, spanning from devoted theism to unequivocal atheism, is welcome here. Having said that, I'll be clear that this is not a podcast about neatly compartmentalized religious identities. Rather, this is a podcast about open explorations of God and life and purpose and meaning that can be found, as it were, all around us, and in ways that reflect our individual lived realities. So this podcast takes stock of and proceeds to comment on Christianity in particular and religion more generally in what Dietrich Bonhoeffer would come to call a world come of age. So I've mentioned Bonhoeffer's name for the location of this house, as well as this kind of curious statement that he makes at the end of my introduction to the podcast. So let's learn a bit about Bonhoeffer here. So the biography of Bonhoeffer is available from various scholars, But I just want to point out one, or just a summary of his biography. That's what I call Dietrich Bonhoeffer's narrative of dissent, because he's an enormously important figure in 20th century theology, and I think going forward will be one of the most important figures in theology that we. Well, now he's seldom read in many circles and discussed, but in fact, his opposition to the Nazis was incredible, and his theology is just absolutely fascinating. So little, not fully appreciated yet, but in time will become, in my opinion, one of the most important theological thinkers of the 20th century, and in fact of modern times, if I may. So I'll give you a brief introduction to Bonhoeffer here, and just via his narrative of dissent, and a bit about how it is that we are here in this Bonhoeffer house in Berlin, and what exactly happened to him whilst he was here. So to begin, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German pastor, theologian, political dissident, and now oft-branded martyr, was born in 1906 in Breslau, in what was then Prussian land, under the jurisdiction of the German Empire. The region of Bonhoeffer's birth is now part of Poland. In 1912, his family moved to Berlin, where Bonhoeffer would grow up. He begins his theological studies at Tübingen in 1923. In 1930, he moves to New York for a time and becomes immersed in social justice issues, particularly concerning racial oppression. He also develops a passion for black gospel music. In 1931, he returns to Germany and is offered a lectureship at the University of Berlin. In 1933, Hitler is installed as the German chancellor, and within days of this event, Bonhoeffer is already on public radio to attack the policies of the new chancellor. Unsurprisingly, he is restricted from any further public broadcasting. In 1934, the Confessing Church is founded, and Bonhoeffer is a key figure in this process. Among other things, the Confessing Church makes it clear that Christ, not Hitler or any other political figure, is the head of the church. This is, of course, in direct opposition to what was then called the German Christians, an ecclesiastical organization that was at least sympathetic, if not wholly assimilated to the ideological principles of Nazism. From 1934 to 1935, Bonhoeffer is briefly in England to lead a parish for a German community in London. He returns to Germany in 1935, and in that same year, the Confessing Church is legally invalidated, and any further activities become subject to arrest. In 1936, having been identified as a political dissident, Bonhoeffer's authorization to teach at the University of Berlin is revoked. Bonhoeffer returns to the United States in 1939, but due to his theological commitments on, say, for example, the cost of discipleship, he returns to Germany shortly thereafter. And from there forward, he remains in Germany. In 1940, Bonhoeffer is totally forbidden to speak in public forums and must report to the police for regular reviews. This is followed in 1941 by complete censorship of his writings. In other words, he is forbidden to publish. On April 5th, 1943, Bonhoeffer is arrested from the very house where I'm now sitting and located for this recording, and incarcerated in Tegel prison in the north of Berlin on suspicions related to his suspected affiliations to the German resistance, broadly, and in particular the Schwarze Kapelle, that is the Black Orchestra, who were a group of German conspirators against Hitler who actually worked within German intelligence and other government posts. And this, my friends, is where our story begins, with his incarceration at Tegel prison. Whilst incarcerated in Tegel, Bonhoeffer was writing letters often to family and friends, and there were some curious modes of communication that were occurring through those letters. It's something that'll be addressed later. But one of the people that he was in contact most often of all of his through his letters was Eberhard Bethke, who was in fact his best friend and confidant. And these letters are occurring on a very regular basis. But on April 30th, 1944, they take a particular twist in terms of their content and tone. And this letter that I'm about to read is actually what is the first of Bonhoeffer's theological letters that emerged from his time in Tegel prison. There were a number of these letters. All of them are fascinating in their own right and touch on different content and questions. But this one is the first one, and I think it's worth reading to get a sense of kind of the context or the emotional situation in which we find Dietrich Bonhoeffer in this case, and his estimation of where Christianity is going and where religion is going in a world that seems to be without any religion, or at least is heading quickly in that direction. So I'll begin this letter. So it's dated the 30th of April 1944. Again, it's to his friend Eberhard Bethke. So, dear Eberhard, another month has gone by. Is a time rushing by for you the way it is for me here? I'm often surprised at this myself, and will the month come when you come home to Renata and I to Maria, and the two of us can meet again? The feeling that any day great events can shake the world and change all our personal circumstances is so strong in me that I'd like to write you much more often, because we don't know how long we still can. But most of all, to share everything with you as often and as long as possible. Actually, I'm firmly convinced that by the time you get this letter, the great decisions will be moving along on every front. So in the coming weeks, we shall have to be stout-hearted, and that is what I wish you. We have to keep our wits about us so that nothing catches us off guard. In view of what is coming, I'm almost inclined to quote the biblical, "It must come to pass," and I feel something of the longing of the angels in 1 Peter 1:12 to see how God will go about solving what seems to be beyond any solution. I think has come to the point where God will arise and accomplish something that we, despite our inner and outer involvement, can only take in with the greatest astonishment and awe. Somehow it will be made plain for those with eyes to see that Psalm 58:11 and Psalm 9:19 to 20 are true, and we shall have to repeat Jeremiah 45:5 to ourselves every day. For you, separated as you are, it's even harder than it is for me to go through this, and I'll especially be thinking of you as I'm already doing now. How good it would be for both of us if we could live through this time together and stand by each other. But it's probably even better that we can't, but rather that each of us has to go it alone. It's hard for me not to be able to help you in any way except by thinking of you. I really do. Every morning and evening when I read the Bible, and often during the day too. Please don't worry about me at all. I'm getting along uncommonly well. You'd be surprised if you came to see me. People here keep saying to me, and I'm very flattered by it, that as you can see, that I radiate such peace and that I'm always so cheerful, so that if I occasionally experience myself as anything but, I suppose it's deceptive, which I don't really believe. Now, here begins the theological element of it, and this is uh, it takes quite a turn. So, what might surprise you, or perhaps even worry you about my thoughts and where they are leading, and here, what might surprise you, or perhaps even worry you, would be my theological thoughts and where they are leading. And here is really where I miss you very much. I don't know anyone else with whom I can talk about them and arrive the same clarity. What keeps gnawing at me is this question: what is Christianity? Or, who is Christ for us today? The age when people could tell that, that with words, whether theological or with pious words, is past, as is the age of inwardness and conscience, and that means the age of religion altogether. We are approaching a completely religionless age. People as they are now simply cannot be religious anymore. Even those who honestly describe themselves as religious aren't really practicing that at all. They presumably mean something quite different by religious, but our entire 1900 years of Christian preaching and theology are built on a religious a priori in human beings. Christianity has always been a form, perhaps the true form, of religion. Yet, if it becomes obvious one day that this a priori doesn't exist, that it has been a historically conditioned and transitory form of human expression, then people really will become radically religionless. And I believe that is already more or less the case. Why, for example, doesn't this war provoke a religious reaction like all the previous ones? What does what does that mean for Christianity? The foundations are being pulled out from under all that Christianity has previously been for us. And the only people among whom we might end up in terms of religion are the last of the knights, or a few intellectually dishonest people. Are they supposed to be the chosen few? Are we supposed to fall over precisely this dubious lot of people in our zeal or disappointment or woe and try to peddle our ware to them? Or should we jump on a few unfortunates in their hour of weakness and commit, so to speak, religious rape? If we are unwilling to do any of that, and if we eventually must judge even the Western form of Christianity to be only a preliminary stage of complete absence of religion, what kind of situation emerges for us and for the church? How can Christ become Lord of the religionless as well? Is there such a thing as a religionless Christian? If religion is only the garb in which Christianity is clothed, and this garb has looked very different in very different ages, what then is a religionless Christianity? Barth, who is the only person to have begun thinking along these lines, nevertheless did not pursue the thoughts all the way, did not think about them through, and but ended up with a positivism of revelation, which in the end essentially remained a restoration. For the working person or anyone who is without religion, nothing decisive has been gained here. The question to be answered would be, what does a church, a congregation, a sermon, a liturgy, a Christian life mean in a religionless world? How do we talk about God without religion? That is without temporally conditioned presuppositions or metaphysics, inner life, and so on. How do we speak about God? How do we go about being religionless, worldly Christians? How can we be the church or those called out without understanding ourselves as religiously privileged, but instead seeing ourselves as belonging wholly to the world? Christ would then no longer be the object of religion, but something else entirely, tr- truly Lord of the world. But what does that mean? In a situation, what does the ritual cultus and prayer mean? Is this where the arcane discipline or the difference which you've heard about from me before between the penultimate and the ultimate have new significance? I have to stop for today, so this letter can go off right now. I'll write more the day after tomorrow about this. I hope you understand more or less what I mean, and it's not boring you. Goodbye for now, and it's not easy having to write without a response. You must forgive me if that makes it something of a monologue. I'm really not reproaching you for not writing. You have ever so much else to do. Yours as ever. I think about you very much, Dietrich. This is the beginning of Bonhoeffer's theological letters, and it is loaded with provocations which he, in fact, never has the chance to answer. Nonetheless, they are left for us to work with, and that implies two ways in which we can answer these questions. So let's just go over the key questions again. Again, he starts this section by saying, "What might surprise you, or perhaps even worry you, would be my theological thoughts and where they are leading." So you can see this in this sense, a division or an unexpected evolution that even his best friend and just in dialogue partner for religious discussions perhaps might not be expecting. So, what is Christianity, or who is Christ for us today? Who is Christ for us today in a world where religion feels very different than it did in the first century Levant or in 12th century Paris? So the context is in filled out. It says the this is the age when we could tell people with words, whether theological or with pious words, is past, as is the age of inwardness and consciousness. And that means the age of religion altogether. We are approaching a completely religionless age. People as they are now simply cannot be religious anymore. So this is Bonhoeffer's estimation of religion and culture from his prison cell in the north of Berlin in Tegel prison in 1944. Now, granted, the situation is harrowing to be sure and absolutely sobering for him, but his insights in this case might be unique and extremely valuable, even though they might not completely correspond to the way in which the world looked after the war, and the way the world looks now. In any case, it's important to remember that the way that he sees it, at least, the foundations are being pulled out from under all that Christianity had previously been for us. So another key question that I want to address in this case is if we eventually must judge even the Western form of Christianity to be only a preliminary stage of a complete absence of religion, what kind of situation emerges for us and for the church? How can Christ become Lord of the religionless as well? Is there such a thing as a religionless Christian? Interesting question. If religion is only the garb in which Christianity is clothed, and this garb has looked very different in very different ages, what then is a religionless Christianity? So, how do we conceive of or think of Christianity in a religionless world? This is the context in which it is received and through which it is then projected. How do we talk about God without religion? Absolutely fascinating question. How do we speak about God? How do we go about being religionless worldly Christians? How can we be the church and those called out without understanding ourselves as being religiously privileged, but instead seeing ourselves as belonging wholly to the world? What does this mean? He goes on to ask. So there's a series of absolutely fascinating questions here, which we're going to be addressing as time moves on. And there are a variety of ways of interpreting this. Let's call them generally the scholarly way of interpreting it, and number two, the constructive way of interpreting it. Um, and what I want to do is not neglect one for the other, but actually treat them both because I think that presents the possibility for the best outcomes. So, in terms of a scholarly interpretation, what we might try to do is have an in-depth reading of Bonhoeffer's previous works. What has he been reading whilst in prison or during this time of extreme tension, and try and plot a trajectory to say this is where we think he was likely heading with these very unique provocations. This would be a more scholarly way to address the questions that Bonhoeffer poses in these theological letters, and it's absolutely worth addressing. We must do that in order to proceed in an honest and a more robust manner. Now, there's also a constructive way to go about it. This is more theological freewheeling, as it were. So what we do is we look at these questions, and we just simply ask them as provocations to ourselves now. There's less importance, significance put on context and biography, and more on existential situation where we find ourselves now, and a question that's openly asked to us that we can then perhaps provide an answer or deepen with another question to follow up with it. That's a more constructive approach. So we're actually building our own theological ideas in that sense, and that's probably where I would tend to fall is in terms of my model and approach to theology. But I also am extremely appreciative of the scholarly work that many good thinkers do, and advancing ideas on how we are to best receive these prison letters in light of Bonhoeffer's biography and the trajectory of his thinking, and we'll address actually both of them. Now, what Karl Barth actually has to say would does actually open the door for the constructive approaches. And the way that I like to think them and oftentimes present them to students is just a set of provocations for you to consider in depth, and then answer as time and circumstance move forward, and you feel that you're able to provide an answer that's meaningful. So what Karl Barth says in this case is very curious. He says, without being able to speak to him, that is Bonhoeffer personally, we shall have to make do with remaining behind, somewhat confused. Do we not always expect him to be clear and more concise in some other context, either withdrawing what he had said or by going even further? Now he left us alone with the enigmatic utterances of his letters. At more than one point, clearly showing that he sensed, without really knowing, how the story should continue, especially how the program of an unreligious speech was to be realized. So that's Karl Barth's commentary on Dietrich Bonhoeffer's letters, in this case, the theological letters. And again, Barth is a giant of 20th century theology, Protestant theology. So again, we're going to be taking this podcast in both directions: a scholarly reading and a constructive reading of Bonhoeffer's letters. And this is just the beginning of it. We'll be going through these letters and these questions at a relatively slow pace, because they deserve attention, and they provide absolutely fertile ground for cultivating some brilliant ideas regarding where it is that religion and Christianity are heading in the moment, the cultural and historical moment that we now inhabit. What does Christianity, what does religion look like now? What is it going to look like perhaps going forward? And what are the most productive ways that we can reconfigure the way in which it's presented or meets us in our cultural situation where we stand now, to be received and to be provide meaning for us once again. So that'll be the project number one of this podcast, and I very much look forward to carrying on this dialogue with all of you. Thank you.